This week on the Powell Not Found podcast, Paul versus Tyson. The fight of the weekend comes and goes, and it doesn't leave without huge streaming problems. And Tetris Forever, my thoughts on that new game/interactive documentary that I implore everybody to go see. And some baseball news is trickling out in the offseason. Coming up next in this episode of the Powell Not Found podcast. Here we go.
I'm gonna tell you a story about a girl who loves gin. A national pandemic seized her birthday celebration. Although she knew it was coming, we tried not to tell her. She brewed some Irish breakfast. Did she knew her birthday was getting corona?
Hey, everybody, and welcome back to episode 43. It says 42 on the bottom ticker there, but it's actually episode 43 of the Powell Not Found podcast, coming to you from the week of November 17th of 2024. We're going to get straight into it this week and talk about what ended up happening at this weekend with the big prize fight, big clown show, big event, media frenzy, whatever you kind of want to call it. It was something that was very atypical of normal boxing, but we'll talk a little bit about the Tyson-Paul fight coming up. We'll talk a little bit about Tetris Forever and some baseball tidbits. Tuned in to this fight. I normally would not watch boxing. I normally wouldn't watch UFC. This is not something that necessarily gets into my world and my zeitgeist, if you will, on a regular basis. I feel like there's got to be something that's very, very atypical or very, very, very strange for me to start tuning into a prize fight like this. It feels very 1970s in a way, tuning into a prize fight, seeing who's going to really come out on top. And this one kind of had it. I mean, former YouTuber, brother of Logan Paul, Jake Paul, turned boxer, turned heel, kind of facing off against how do you put it nicely, geriatric looking Mike Tyson there. So there was interest on both sides of the equation. I think most of the country wanted to see Mike Tyson take out Jake Paul. I think there is something interesting about seeing a 58-year-old, if he can actually come back and fight in any kind of way. I think we're proved that just doesn't happen. I think age gets to us all, no matter how hard we try to fight it. And we also have the theatrics that were going on for seemingly months. I just tuned in 3 days before the actual match when it seemed like it was getting fever pitch, and I decided to kind of tune in. So I was all ready, basically, about to get myself started, get myself ingratiated with the boxing world, what it's become, since its heyday back in the 70s and 80s, 60s, 70s, and 80s. I feel like boxing doesn't exactly have a role anymore in today's society. It didn't seem like it's, with everything kind of split the way it is, with attention spans in different sectors and different genres and stuff. No longer, I think, do I think that things of the past, like boxing, that could co-opt a certain amount of viewership, could really do this anymore. And I think, the only reason that this attracted, I guess, according to the Hollywood Reporter, 60 million viewers is because you had, some of the biggest, the biggest streaming platform behind it, kind of like marketing it. And so I decided to kind of tune in. And that's where my problems began. Because one could argue that this shouldn't be a problem in today's society, the buffering. I probably went in and out of Netflix about 3 or 4 times. I tried pausing it like it was a video from 1996 that I was trying to watch from a dial-up modem. It was bad. There were several times where I felt like I didn't get to watch any of the beginning of this fight. I tuned in right, probably around like 11:30 because I had found out that that Tyson and Paul are not going to go on right at 8. It was a 5-hour event, all in all, which is just too long for an event these days. That might be the case in normal boxing events and normal things, and if that is, I'm speaking out of turn. But for all this trouble and struggle that I was going through, it seemed like the whole rest of the nation was going through it as well. Buffering problems, technical problems, and I don't feel that bad for Netflix in this case. And one would argue that, being a video person trying to put on a live production, it is tough stuff. Things are going to fail. There's a lot of points of failure along the chain to try to get the event that's happening somewhere to your television set or to your computer monitor or to your iPad. There are a lot of different things that it has to go through, and a lot of things have to go right for a live production to kind of go off. Now, this is something that the television broadcasting stations were probably sitting back and chuckling a little bit watching this happen, because this is something they've kind of fine-tuned over decades of production experience. When I was in the news, we had I have no idea if these are used anymore, but we had these things called TVU packs that basically were these big backpacks that we strapped to our backs, and they would broadcast the signal out to a satellite truck, then to a satellite truck to the production room, from the production room to the wherever server that they were holding it on, and then the server would basically go to your internet provider or to your television feed and over the air, right? And it would you can kind of see the same remnants of some of these things even when you watch the event, right? If you look at the cameraman, you can see a whole big giant, bags strapped to their back, or you see the audio guy with a big audio bag, right? Inside that stuff, feeds are coming from every which way into some sort of switcher, right? It looked like the load in this particular case was too much for them to handle. They said 60 million people, let me push this back up, tuned into this fight, right? Which is, just to give you a little bit of a comparison, this last Super Bowl, 123 million people tuned in, right? And for a fight that was highly publicized and whatever, this is pretty good numbers. I mean, the World Series with the Yankees and the Dodgers, now think about this, the World Series with the Yankees and the Dodgers only garnered around 15.2 million or something, 16 million. So it quadrupled the viewership for the World Series, which is not unexpected. I mean, the baseball is the national pastime. You can be romantic about baseball, but when it comes down to it, it's a regional sport, right? It's a national sport, but it's very localized. If you have two big markets, you got to hope for the best, but it's not going to pull the best numbers. But it pulled about half the Super Bowl, right? Which is respectable, right? Also, a little bit disappointing though, considering that even though 60 million people tuned in, 50 million people, according to the Hollywood Reporter article, tuned in for the Serrano-Taylor fight before that, which was brutal and really, really tough to watch, actually, if you watch the whole match. I finally got to watch that after the fact. 60 million people didn't get access to the stream, which is bad, right? A lot of things could have contributed to the failure of the stream. It could have been the load of the audience. It could have been the load on the audience at the servers, right, that they're pointing it to. So every single time a live broadcast goes out from wherever they are, there's a number of transfers that it ends up having to happen. So in a very, very basic way, you have the cameramen that are out in the field, right? All their images and their sound and their audio and their video and stuff gets packaged and sent via usually SRT machines and back to the video switcher room, right, or wherever the production room is, right? So it has to make that trip first. It gets ingested into a video production suite where they're cutting it on the fly, and then it gets sent out to servers, right? These are the big data servers that you see sometimes around the nation now, and those servers end up splitting the feed into whatever feed that your home ingest. So if you're watching Netflix at 1080p, or if you're watching Netflix and your internet provider, or basically if your internet can only support 720p, that server makes that decision going to your house that, hey, this home can only, see the feed in 720p. So it splits them out into multiple different feeds, different resolutions to accommodate everybody, no matter where you are in the country and what your internet strength is, right? Well, there's also the matter of doing that process 60 million times, right? And if it does it 60 million times, and if it can't handle that kind of load and that kind of demand, then you start seeing the buffering problems that we are seeing online and the complaints that, hey, this is not running, it's not working. Netflix has run into this before with different things. They have a football game coming up with the Chiefs on Christmas. And so it'll be interesting to see if this just was their test case, and this is their, where else are you going to find 60 million people? Where else are you going to find 120 million people to test whether your servers are the best? My argument is, if you're Netflix and if you have this much money, then you gotta at least do the research to find out what other people are doing in this case. I mean, the Super Bowl streamed fine. The Super Bowl didn't have any kind of buffering problems. In the beginning, I believe the Super Bowl ran into kind of bitrate and resolution problems, but there were at times where the resolution was so bad on the Netflix stream that it looked like I was watching Punch Out on the Nintendo. I mean, I probably could have had a better viewing experience actually watching a fight from Punch Out or Super Punch Out, but it was bad. The fight itself was kind of disappointing. It didn't look like a boxing fight to me. It looked like somebody. And I have no experience with boxing whatsoever. I can't really speak to it or talk to it, but it didn't really feel like it was energetic. And especially after taking in and finally watching without stutter on demand the next day, the other fights that we had, there was a lot more attack. There was a lot more interaction. It felt like a lot of people doing a soft shoe in the ring. Against each other, and a few jabs here and there. Mike Tyson did not look like Mike Tyson of old. He did not look aggressive. He said in a post game that he was nursing an injury. And Jake Paul, I don't think did anything to make his image any kind of better. I know, in these boxing matches you play a character, but I think by the end, I don't think he did anything to endear his character anymore to the nation with this kind of stunt. And that's what it kind of felt like. It felt like you tuned in to watch a publicity stunt and that's the nicest way to kind of put it. I mean, one would argue that, are you going to get 60 million people without Mike Tyson's name attached to this fight? Probably not, right? You're tuning in for Mike Tyson at an older age, right? You're tuning in to see if he can prove himself again against a young, cocky opponent. It had it very much like a Rocky IV vibe, when the one Hulk Hogan's in Rocky III, Rocky IV. I think it's Apollo, and then maybe Rocky III. It had those kind of vibes to it. And then once you saw the fight, it had Rocky Balboa vibes, where Rocky's like 58 in the ring and he's trying it again. You're like, this is a bad idea. People could get hurt, So I don't think that this is going to move the needle for anybody to watch boxing going forward. If they keep it on Netflix, I think they're going to end up just getting viewership just because the audience base is so big. There's 320 some odd million people subscribed to Netflix. So a big chunk, a sizable chunk of people tuned in. But whenever you're given something for free that has previously not been for free, has previously been behind pay-per-view walls and stuff like that for these types of fights, I think you're generally going to find a bigger audience. It will be interesting to see if it can sustain a 60 million viewer mark and keep on going and going and going. And if it does, then good for them. They've tapped into something that hasn't been in the zeitgeist for quite some time, but I don't believe that's going to be the case. So that's my thoughts on the Tyson-Paul fight. I'm glad I tuned in for it. It felt like it was something that people were gonna talk about. People were gonna chat about. But ultimately disappointing. Felt like two people that probably shouldn't be in a ring together, and it ended up being more hype, more celebrity hype, and more of a publicity stunt than actually a real fight. We're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, I'm going to talk about something that I'm really actually passionate about, which is a new game by Digital Eclipse called Tetris Forever, coming up on the Powell Not Found podcast. Let's push to commercial, and we'll be right back.
Tell you a story about a girl who loves gin. A national pandemic seized her birthday celebration. Although she knew it was coming, we tried not to tell her. She brewed some Irish breakfast. Did she knew her birthday was getting corona?
Hey, everybody, and welcome back to episode 43 of the Powell Not Found podcast. Go ahead and subscribe to the YouTube channel. Go look us up on Apple Podcasts, on Spotify, on all the places where you get your podcasts, and review and interact with the show. Chat, comment below. Nice comments are always appreciated. Bad comments are always ignored, so don't waste your time. And go help grow the show. We're trying to do everything that we can. So we're on Instagram, on TikTok, and all the different channels. This week, on November 12th, a game came out by Digital Eclipse called Tetris Forever. Now, if you know anything about me, I love the game of Tetris. There's something about the game that kind of puts me into a peaceful state when playing it. And so when Tetris, other Tetris games came out, like Tetris, the Tetris Effect that came out in 2018, I loved it, right? Because it kind of gave new life to an old puzzle game that's honestly never going to get old just because of the way it's designed. And a couple years ago, too, Apple Plus put out a movie called Tetris, and I had to watch it because it's starring Taron Egerton, and it talked about the origins of Tetris. Now, the movie itself, I want to be very, very clear. The movie itself takes a lot of chances. It's very dramatic, and maybe takes the word is creative liberty, and about making it more of an action movie than it probably actually needs to be. It's still a fun movie. Go watch it on Apple Plus TV, because it's something that's gets you introduced to this crazy origin story of how Tetris kind of came to be. So Digital Eclipse on November 12th puts out basically what they're calling an interactive documentary talking about how this story came to be and how really this game escaped the Soviet Union around 1985 and how it was traded from floppy disk to floppy disk to floppy disk and finally kind of broke through, as they put it, the interactive curtain. So what you're presented with is not only like a playable timeline, but you're presented with the games. Some of them are recreations, and some of them are actually the ROMs that you would have gotten had you been purchasing video games back in the 80s. And those are available to play. But interspliced in between these playable demos, these playable games, right, are the videos filled with footage of the story of how this stuff came to be. So you see interviews of Alexei Pachinov, the guy who created Tetris. You see interviews with Hank Rogers, the man who was working for, who went to the Soviet Union to license Tetris under his company Bulletproof Software. And you also see some interviews with his daughter, and it goes back and forth with them and intersplicing their own personal footage of how they kind of got to know each other and how a friendship kind of led to this Tetris craze that kind of took over not only in Japan, but in America. So Hank Rogers, his interviews are fascinating. Alexei Pachinov's interviews are fascinating. What's really, really interesting about the two of them is that they couldn't be more different, and they're weaving this story together. Digital Eclipse did something very, very similar to this when talking about Atari a couple years ago with a game called Atari 50. And if you don't have the personal connection with those games because you're either too young or, you know, or you just were introduced to video games at a later time and they make those games inaccessible, you tend to bounce off of that story a little bit. That being said, the videos within that package still as compelling as the videos in this package. This game, the story of him going over to the Soviet Union and talking to Alexei Pachinov and talking to these agencies that wouldn't allow Alexei Pachinov to sell this game, and how it becomes an international rights battle, is fascinating. It's one of the things that makes this whole package compelling. I mean, anybody, and we've seen many times before, people putting together archival collections of old games that may have fallen out of accessibility. Putting the context next to these games is really important, because it gives you an idea of not only how something grows over time, and there's several games in this package. I mean, right now there's about, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. There's like 14 different Tetris games, all kind of licensed by Bulletproof Software, that are in this package, excluding some of the ones from Nintendo, which are Game Boy Tetris, NES Tetris. There's ones that have been excluded just probably because of licensing deals. So it's not a cohesive, complete one. It is basically the ones that they could get. But you start seeing why these things are important and why they were making these risks. And if you bought these games separately, if you bought these games 14 in a row without hearing how they arrived at these games, you would probably feel ripped off. But knowing the context of what they were trying to do and how they were trying to evolve the game over time, and what they were trying to do and try to change it, and how they started changing little rules in the games, and why things kind of came to be, and why they had to pull things back at certain times, that's what makes this collection really shine. Also, within those videos that they put, those video interviews that they put within those playable demos, they give you also the marketing material around it, right? This is what kind of makes it rewatchable in a way, replayable in a way. The games are always going to stand on their own, but the marketing material is fascinating just from a timepiece perspective, because you see how graphic design kind of evolves over time. You see what was playing in certain countries and certain worlds. You see it from the Japanese side predominantly, but you also see some American ads, because there's a battling company called Mirrorsoft that's also licensing Tetris, because people were confused about who had the rights to what. And that's a really, really interesting kind of touch, like a cornerstone, right? To see how many things that the people are trying to get in front of people to sell these games. The one criticism of the game, though, is that it's so video heavy in the beginning, right? And it is, the origin story is always kind of interesting. And then it does get a little bit kind of clouded in who owns what. And by the back half of the game, you're starting to see more games kind of come out and less video. And then it starts to kind of falter a little bit. There are some great games in this package, including Tetris Battle Gaiden, which was they even mention it in the game that it's a cult hit. I got introduced to that game watching videos of Giant Bomb play it. And I was always very curious about the origins of, like, how did this game not take off? Because this game seems like Battle Tetris seems like such a good idea. Something that was actually revisited later in Tetris 99 by Nintendo, 4 years ago. It does fall on its face, though, because it starts pulling back on the videos, and then game after game after game, you start seeing the syndication, you start seeing the licensing kind of really start working, and more versions of these games kind of come out, which kind of leads to a little bit of fatigue in that way. So you start kind of rushing through it a little bit towards the end, and then it wraps up pretty well. The timeline, the interactive documentary kind of genre that they've created here is, I think, very, very important for kind of the preservation aspect, to make these games accessible, but also to give you another thing to look for in these games, right? Other than the actual gameplay. You start kind of looking to see, okay, did this work? Did this not? It's fascinating to see that kind of play out. Their thinking, their trial and error play out in real time, and have you go along in that journey with them. Also, from a marketer's perspective, it's really interesting to see how these rights and how these deals get done. It very much seemed like a Wild Westy kind of time in a beginning of an industry that was less formalized. And now you start getting context too why when you see video games come out later, they go, we don't even know who owns the rights. And part of me, as a younger person who heard that, couldn't understand why it would get that messy. This is a perfect example of why rights and who owns them gets messy, because in the beginning there's not much of a paper trail that really can, you can find your way back to who owns what. I hope to see more of this stuff. This is the third entry in what they're calling the Gold Master series. I guess they've done Atari 50. I'm actually curious to go back and watch all the rest of those videos. I think I got kind of a little bogged down with the actual games because they were so remedial in that package. They also have a Llamasoft one by Jeff Minter, where they go through his kind of evolution as a game designer. And now they have Tetris. I would love to see this kind of style with other foundational and great games. I would like to see this just in general with like movie directors, to be perfectly honest. I don't even think it has to be games. It would be interesting to see this kind of interactive documentary format move to different genres as well. So go look at this game, go pick up this game. If you have any kind of love for Tetris, you're going to be immediately attached to playing all these different versions. I mean, playing a reproduction of Alexei Petronov's original version of Tetris is kind of mind-boggling in general. And also seeing some of the things that he built this computer game on is kind of mind-blowing, right? To see the Electronica 60 that he's playing with that has barely any kind of graphical power, and he's still able to kind of create a game. There's also fascinating moments in there too. There's at one point I think Alexei Petronov says specifically that they want to move it to MS-DOS and IBM computers, and he's like, I just can't program this thing again. There's these relatable moments that you have with these characters throughout the entire time that are really, really interesting to watch and really, really fun. There's sometimes the movie does stray away from certain elements of the game itself and talks about just like working with your family, right? Eventually, Hank's daughter takes over Tetris Incorporated, which was Bulletproof Software. And he talks about the struggles of someone working with your daughter, right, or working with your family, and how he doesn't want to spoil any kind of relationship that he has with his family because his family is a limited resource. So there's really interesting tidbits of stuff that's flowing through this documentary, and they did such a good job. We talked about last week an NPR article saying about the movie Here, about how they would be more interested in seeing how they made Here than watching the movie Here, which I don't really agree with. Part of me hopes that there's more content coming along the way for this game because the undertaking that this must have been to collect all this stuff and put it into a timeline and put it into a cohesive narrative, that's the accomplishment here. And to see what they decided to cut, what they decided to put in there, why they decided to put in certain things in a certain order would be very, very interesting to kind of hear. There's a lot of times like reinforcement throughout the timeline and throughout the interactive dashboard that you're going through that kind of you hear it and then you see it, right? And so that it cements in your mind. You don't get like a one and done kind of like a hit of information and then moving on. you get reinforced with these decision points over and over and over again. And so it would be interesting to see and hear about the process behind making the game and behind what they envision for other things going forward. If they want to expand the story, if they can expand the story, it comes to a pretty cohesive ending by the time you get to the end. So go check out the game, Tetris Forever. It's the third in the Grandmaster series by Digital Eclipse. This is out on Nintendo Switch, PlayStation 4, PlayStation 5, Windows, and Xbox platforms. So it is a great game. I have a personal affinity for Tetris. I know a lot of people don't like the game, but if you take anything out of this, go watch the Tetris movie, and then you'll understand why I've been harping about, why the origin story of this game is sometimes more interesting than the actual game itself. And it seems wild what they do in order to get the rights for this game, but it's very, very early industry, Wild Westy kind of story. And I'm glad it's kind of canonized now in a interactive format that gives people more context than maybe the poetically licensed movie did for a bit. So when we come back, we'll talk a little bit about baseball notes here for the offseason. There's some small little Yankee news, small little Oriole news coming up after the break, and then we'll wrap up the show.
Story about a girl who loves gin. A national pandemic seized her birthday celebration. Although she knew it was coming, we tried not to tell her. She brewed some Irish breakfast. Did she knew her birthday was getting corona?
Hey, everybody, and welcome back to the rest of the show. This is the Powell Not Found podcast, episode 43. Before we go, I just wanted to kind of touch on a little bit of baseball news that came out. A couple of them being Yankee bits, but the first one I want to touch on deals with a little bit of news closer to home. And that is the Baltimore Orioles are finally changing their left field dimensions to something more reasonable. 3 years ago, I guess 2021, 2020, they moved back their left field fence to a preposterous 398. Camden Yards had always been a hitter's ballpark. People loved hitting home runs there. People called it Yankee Stadium South. It was a very, very friendly ballpark. The Orioles had a hard time kind of drafting any kind of pitchers to kind of come there and pitch for their park because they knew it didn't have Colorado's stigma, but it certainly had something. So they changed their dimensions. This is according to an athletic article by Steve Berman coming out a couple days ago. In 2020, the Orioles moved the left field. This is a quote. The Orioles moved the left field wall back as much as 26.5 feet in some spots and raised the wall from 7 feet to 13 feet high between the 2021 and 2022 seasons, creating an environment that delighted pitchers while frustrating hitters, especially those who bat right-handed. The changes in left field left some to dub that section of the park. It was, quote, Mount Baltimore. It also made Camden Yards look horrendously ugly. It was not something that was easy to kind of get used to over the years. I'm glad that they're moving it back. I guess they're pulling in the wall 17 feet, and they're lowering the height back to kind of a normal and respectable 9 to 11 feet in height. It's going to make the park look a little bit more symmetrical. I think the way that it was pushed back so dramatically gave you Polo Grounds, Polo Grounds depth illusions in your head that were going to kind of going off. I mean, Polo Grounds was ridiculous. If you ever look at the dimensions, go check it out. I guess they called Polo Grounds the bathtub because of the way that the dimensions was. It was a 489 or something, 483 to center field. I mean, no one's hitting it at Polo Grounds. I believe Polo Grounds even had like a temporary fence at some point because it was so deep. At some point, no one was going going to hit a home run. It was that crazy. But it was also 297 and 263 to the pole or something like that. It was a ridiculous dimension. This kind of gave that same vibe that if you pulled the ball as a right-handed hitter, you were just flying out or getting a double or something like that. I saw Aaron Judge one time hit a home run out there. But this makes it a little bit less of a extremity in left field, and also probably helps the Orioles offense quite a bit. Remember, both sides are using each park, right? So all the criticism that Yankee Stadium gets for being a short porch, remember, both teams get to use the short porch. In this particular case, it felt like this was too much of a stretch, right? Nobody cares about them pulling the wall back, but at some point, 398 or 384 or whatever it was, for the dimensions of the field was just too far back, and also it took the fans away from the action even more. I mean, more and more you're seeing fields build new ballparks so that the fans are right on top of the action. The foul territory is gone. It's no longer like Oakland or former Oakland, and the Coliseum, where it had ample ground and bullpens and stuff like that, but the fans were further away. It was an interesting thing to see the left field get affected like this because they pushed fans away from the action quite dramatically, and in order to kind of bring down the level of home runs. Now, according to this Athletic article, it looked like in 2022, the home run totals in Baltimore have ranged from 82 to 104 in the 2024 season. So it did affect and pull down the total, I guess, from 139. And so it helped, but it also, as much as it helped, it probably hindered the Baltimore Orioles actually hitting. So I like this new medium. It will probably make the park look better. I mean, Camden for years enjoyed, the moniker the most beautiful park. And then after they did this in 2021, it was quite ugly. And so I'm glad that they're fixing something that needed to be desperately fixed. The last couple things is Dave Sims. Looks like he's officially the Mariners play-by-play guy. He looks like he's officially getting the new job, taking over the Yankees radio booth for John Sterling, which is expected. The weird thing about this kind of decision is that Emmanuel Barberi and Justin Shackle and all the other people that filled in, they weren't doing that bad of a job. I was quite surprised about how quickly I got used to hearing them on the radio, especially after decades of John Sterling. And after a while, like, it wasn't the same. They had their own quirks. I kind of liked the fact that Justin Shackle and Emmanuel Barberi really stuck to their guns about who they were. They weren't trying to be John Sterling. And but they go with Dave Sims, 71 years old, getting a Yankee radio job. I guess Susan Wallman suggested him. And he's coming back to call New York sports. So that should be interesting and a different take on the Yankees radio booth. He's a very energetic guy. I've listened to a couple clips of him doing the Mariners game. So it should be the kind of energy that they kind of need in that booth. And it was nice. The last season, I was a little bit conflicted having John Sterling kind of come out of retirement to do the playoff run for the Yankees. And it would have been great, and it would have been a fairy tale story had they won. But him calling one last World Series, even though they lost, it seemed like a good thing to do. It seemed like they knew that was going to happen when they called him out of retirement. And it was nice to hear his voice one more time. But to be honest, all these things have to come to an end. And so I'm glad that they're sticking with one person, and he's going to have the job, because the rotation, I think, was a little bit jarring from a listener standpoint, because you didn't know if you were tuning into the right game, even though you're like, I'm on 660 or I'm on the MLB.TV audio. But I'm like, is this the right broadcast? Because they kept on switching out everybody. So I'm glad that there's going to be some consistency there, is what I'm trying to say. And the last article I want to kind of talk about is from Sam Blum and Jason Stark. The Rays, we talked about this on the podcast about how Tropicana Field got destroyed by the hurricane. The top of the Thunderdome, top of the ceiling got ripped off, and $55 million to fix that roof, and it won't be done until the 2025 season. the Rays ballpark has been kind of stuck a little bit in financing problems. They have approved a new ballpark, but they have whether they break ground or not is going to be a different story. But they would not be ready to play in the 2025 season. So the Rays will play in Steinbrenner Field in Tampa after the Yankees have kind of allowed them to play in that ballpark. Now, the ballpark is open air. The ballpark is going to get hit by the summer rain in in Tampa. It's going to be hot. It's going to be sweltering. I imagine a lot of games are going to get moved because of the weather problems that they're going to have down there. It will be a temporary solution for hopefully just the year until they can get back in Tropicana Field. But very, very important that they're going to stay in that kind of area. It wasn't until I listened to a lot of different people that I started thinking about how widespread that problem was if they moved them to Dunedin or if they moved them to Miami. I mean, you're talking about a lot of employees losing jobs, right? So the fact that they're going to be somewhere in the Tampa area, that's great for everybody working. And so they did the right choice here. Will they move games? Will they delay games? Will they do double headers and stuff? Will the season be a mess? Of course it's going to be a mess. But if they can get 60 of the 80 games played here, then they've solved this problem temporarily until Tropicana Field can be back on the marker. Plus, the benefit to other teams is that you're not going to have to deal with the with playing in Tropicana Field. I mean, Tropicana Field's a dump. People have talked about injury, the turf at Tropicana Field being a cesspool for injury, and you're not going to have to worry about that. This is a major league or somewhat major league facility. It has 11,000 people. The Rays do not drive 11,000 people, but you're going to have some interest in the very, very beginning of just seeing a major league game there, right? Like it's going to be fun to see Aaron Judge come down and play a major league game in George Steinbrenner Field that's being broadcast like a major league game, not like a spring training game that you see early on MLB.TV. So that's where the Rays are going to be playing for 80 of their games. It'll be really interesting. Hey, it'll give you a reason to tune into the Rays game, just like how it was interesting to see the Blue Jays playing outside a couple years ago during the COVID seasons. This is going to have that same kind of interest. So next year, we're going to have two teams playing in a spring training site and a minor league facility. It's going to give you an excuse to watch A's games and Rays games. Nothing but benefit, nothing but positivity can come out of those two things just because they're going to drive up viewership, just because things are different. They're trying new things, and that's only good for the game. So with that, I want to wrap up the show. Again, I want to remind everybody to go ahead and subscribe to the podcast. Make sure you help grow this show. And then next week, we'll come back with new things to talk about and new movies to see and stuff like that. And I hope you guys have a good week. And this is Mark Powell with the Powell Not Found podcast saying, see you next week. Bye.
Although she knew it was coming, we tried not to tell her.